All right, ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is from Municipal Infrastructure Investments and Financial Sustainability and how to relate to each other. Virtually every municipality would like to be financially sustainable. What does financially sustainability really mean? How can you achieve financial sustainability in light of infrastructure and asset management challenges we all face today and certainly tomorrow? Helping us explore these questions based on a research project, I want to welcome Bill Hughes. Bill is the Commissioner of Finance and Treasurer for the Regional Municipality of York. He is responsible for the region's $3 billion combined operating and capital budget. That's the fourth largest among Ontario municipalities. Bill also is responsible for the region's treasury, controlship, and information technology services. Prior to joining the region in 2011, Bill held a number of senior positions in the Ontario government, mainly at the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Infrastructure, where he was the Assistant Deputy Minister of Infrastructure Policy and Planning. He has an MBA from the Sulich School of Business and a Master's in Environmental Studies from York University, as well as a Bachelor of Arts degree from University of Toronto. Bill also lectures at the University of Toronto School of Public Policy and Governance, where he co-teaches a graduate course on policy development. He is a member of the board of the Move Ontario Trust. Please help me welcome Bill Hughes to the stage.
Wow, those are bright lights. So thank you, Gary, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to start by saying thank you to AMO for inviting me to speak at this conference. It seems like an excellent conference. My topic today is safeguarding your municipality's future, the quest for financial sustainability, and it is a quest. And like many things that politicians and civil servants do, this one is a bit harder than it looks. You may think that financial sustainability is all about money. That's what people usually think. But the real financial sustainability story is about policy choices, about ethics, and about judgment. So I'm going to take you through a bit of a slide deck today. So here's an overview of my talk. And I'm reporting on some of the results of a fairly wide-ranging research project that AMO has commissioned York Region to carry out on its behalf. And broadly speaking, the purpose of the research is to gain a better understanding of the factors that influence municipal financial sustainability. It's pretty common in the municipal world to say that one size does not fit all. Regardless of what you're talking about, it seems to be a very common phrase. But in the case of financial sustainability, one size might not fit all, but there also isn't a different size for everyone. And part of what we're trying to do is figure out what really matters in achieving financial sustainability. So we'll start with some principles. I always like to start with principles. On the left-hand side of this slide, so it's a bit of an unusual slide, on the left-hand side of this slide, what you're looking at is a picture of an ancient Roman aqueduct that is still in use today. So this aqueduct was built in 19 BC during the reign of the Emperor Augustus. And the man who built it was a guy named Marcus Agrippa, who was a prominent Roman general, a fairly well-known guy. He defeated Antony and Cleopatra at something called the Battle of Actium. And after he did all his general things, he developed an interest in public infrastructure, and he built a whole lot of public infrastructure, including this aqueduct. I'm sure not personally. And it was renovated in 1453, so it was built in 19 BC. It was renovated in 1453 by Pope Nicholas V during the Renaissance. And to this day, this aqueduct brings pure drinking water to various places in Rome, including the Trevi Fountain, which is what you see on the right-hand side of this slide. So you might wonder why I am starting with a picture of a Roman aqueduct in a talk about financial sustainability. And the reason is I wanted to make the point that the decisions that all of you make today have long-lasting significance. They affect not only the quality of life of people today, but also the quality of life of future generations. So always something to keep in mind when you're thinking about financial sustainability. So, like you tell your kids, think long-term. So financial sustainability requires long-term planning. It doesn't just happen. And the key is to take the necessary steps now to manage your risks, both short and long-term. And this is mostly about managing two things, your service levels and your infrastructure, actually especially your infrastructure. So here are 5 things that can tell you whether you're in a financially sustainable position or not. So do you offer a level of service that is commensurate with your willingness to tax and your residents' ability to pay? Can you adjust your service levels in response to changes in economic conditions or transfer payments from other levels of government? Can you keep your infrastructure in a state of good repair? Do you have enough reserves or debt to replace your infrastructure when it needs to be replaced? And can you adjust the amount of infrastructure you have in response to changes that you experience? All municipalities have infrastructure. I think that's obvious to everyone in the room. And therefore, it means that everyone has to do asset management. And if you're not good at asset management, you are not going to be financially sustainable, regardless of what else you do. And here are some of the things that influence financial sustainability. I'm going to talk a bit more about those as we go on. So infrastructure intensity. So how much infrastructure do you have? And we like to measure it on a per household basis. How much do you need to invest, and when do you need to invest it? What fiscal capacity do you have? What's your ability to generate revenue to meet your infrastructure needs? And what obligations do we have to future generations? So now let's look at a conceptual framework that tries to make these ideas a little bit more tangible, and then I'll apply that as we go through the presentation. So we can start by looking at fiscal capacity and infrastructure intensity. So on the left-hand side of this slide, the vertical axis, we have fiscal capacity, and that's measured as weighted assessment per household, and moving up the chart means you have higher fiscal capacity. And on the horizontal axis along the bottom, we have infrastructure intensity, which is measured as the value of your infrastructure on a per household basis. So as you move right, infrastructure per household increases. And you might wonder how much those numbers are. So the average municipality has about $245,000 worth of assessment per household and about $23,000 worth of infrastructure per household, roughly. And infrastructure intensity can vary for a whole bunch of reasons, including just basic geography. So a municipality of 10,000 people, you might have 2 bridges, you might have 15 bridges. It just depends on how much you have in terms of rivers and swamps and where you need to put your roads. So this chart is divided into 4 quadrants, as you can see. And I'm going to start with the top left, which is labeled the fortunate few. And few is the operative word here. These municipalities have strong fiscal capacity, and they have low to moderate infrastructure intensity. So if you're one of these guys, you are in a good place. On the other hand, you might be in the bottom right, which is labeled the unfortunate zone. And if you are unlucky enough to be here, you have relatively low fiscal capacity, but you have high infrastructure intensity. So you have a lot of infrastructure and you don't have much ability to pay for it. And if that is your world, you are likely already having problems. The other 2 quadrants, the bottom left and the top right, are labeled fiscal strategy as critical. And that means you're in a good place along one of the dimensions, but not both. And if you're in this situation, your fiscal strategy is a critical determinant of whether you can be financially sustainable or not. And I'll say more about that in a second. So the next thing you need to do is to look at your investment needs and how urgent they are. And this is a fairly similar looking chart to the one on the previous page. So on the vertical axis, we have infrastructure intensity again, and that means exactly what it did on the previous slide, the amount of infrastructure you have per household. And on the horizontal axis, we have investment needs, which are measured in terms of the age of your assets. And again, we have these 4 quadrants. So starting with the top right this time, labeled potentially unmanageable, this is again where you do not want to be. But some of you may be there already, whether you want to be or not. And it means you have lots of infrastructure that requires investment soon. And in the bottom left, which is labeled manageable with regular budgeting, you're in good shape because you have less infrastructure and it's newer, so you have time to cope with your asset management needs. And in the other two quadrants, just like before, you're high on one dimension and low on the other. And in either case, the quality of your fiscal strategy is going to be critical. So what is a fiscal strategy? So you can see the four elements here on this slide, and you can call it anything. You can call it a fiscal plan, you can call it a long-term financial plan. The name doesn't matter at all. I just happen to have called it a fiscal strategy with my own counsel, so that's what I used in this presentation. So the key thing to know about fiscal strategy is that it's about relationships. So not personal relationships, but financial relationships. So anyone can have a capital plan or a reserve management plan or a debt management plan, and many people these days are concerned about intergenerational equity. But the idea of a fiscal strategy is to figure out the best and most advantageous relationships among these things and to organize those relationships so that you can achieve financial sustainability. So I'll apply this concept in a minute or two. But first, we need to talk about municipal infrastructure. So the municipal context, geography and demographics, and these are two things that really matter to your fiscal sustainability. And the reason it matters is because we think that financial sustainability looks different for different kinds of municipalities. So one of the tricks in this research is figuring out how to group municipalities in a useful way for thinking about different approaches to financial sustainability. And if we can't do that, we will never be able to understand why different municipalities exhibit different financial behavior. So the first thing to realize is that over 80% of our population is concentrated in only 15 large urban areas. So you can see them listed on the sidebar in this graph. And they go all the way from Toronto at the top of the list to Peterborough at the bottom. But the flip side to that big concentration of population in urban areas is that the vast majority of actual municipalities are small. And to put this pretty clearly, while 80% of the population lives in urban areas, 80% of the municipalities have populations under 25,000. So one of the key things that we think we have discovered is that your rate of growth really matters to whether and how you become financially sustainable. So you see a bunch of blue dots on this chart. Each one of the blue dots is one of Ontario's 49 census divisions. So a census division is just a region, a county, a single-tier municipality, or an amalgamated municipality like Hamilton or Ottawa. And what we've done is we've mapped the forecast population growth from now to 2041 on the vertical axis against the historical population growth from 2001 to 2015. So one thing you can see clearly is that, as the title of the slide says, past is future. If you have been growing, you are likely to continue to grow, and if you haven't been growing, you probably still won't in the future. Probably not news that everyone wants to hear, but it seems relatively clear. So we've divided these municipalities into four groups based on their growth profile determined by their standard deviation from the mean. For all you stats people in the room, I won't say any more about that, but that is how we did it. So there is like an underlying methodology. So group one municipalities in the red circle on the right are the fast growers, and they include places like Halton and York. And the second group is shown in the green circle, and they're also growing municipalities. They're just not growing as fast. And they're places like Toronto and Waterloo and Haliburton. And the third group in the yellow circle we have characterized as stable, meaning they're either growing a little bit or they're declining a little bit. And they include places like Thunder Bay. And the last group in the blue circle consists of municipalities with declining populations. And these categories are going to pop up on a few slides in the rest of the presentation. And this slide shows you what many of you already know intuitively. Growing municipalities have more fiscal capacity than municipalities that are not growing. And what this slide shows you is that actually they have a lot more fiscal capacity. So if you're not growing, you're probably going to find achieving financial sustainability a challenge. Doesn't mean it's not possible, it just means it's challenging. And about 40% of Ontario municipalities are in that situation. That is, they're not growing. So now I'm going to talk about the 4 big elements of fiscal strategy, starting with capital, which turns out to be a big fiscal challenge. And this slide tells you that municipalities have far more infrastructure than you would think from just looking at your financial statements. So I'm sure you all get information on your capital from your financial statements, and they actually are not telling you how much capital you really have. And a rough estimate of the value of municipal infrastructure is $270 billion, so almost $100 billion more than what you see on the books. And some of you might be wondering why municipalities have suddenly become so interested and fascinated by asset management. And it's actually, unfortunately, not because today's municipal politicians and officials are a lot smarter than our predecessors. It's because asset management has become a huge challenge to our financial sustainability. And this table shows you why. So 50 years ago, local governments were responsible for a little over 1/3 of the total amount of infrastructure, and today that number has grown to almost 60%. So what we have is a bunch of assets that are getting older, and we have much more responsibility for them than we ever had in the past. And that's one of the key reasons why everybody is so worried about asset management. And that leads us to one of the key issues we were concerned about in this research project, whether we are investing enough in asset management as a sector. So we don't have absolutely definitive data yet, but we've made some pretty good preliminary estimates. And our conclusion is that municipalities are, in fact, not investing nearly enough in asset management. And as you're thinking about asset management, it's pretty clear where the major pressures are going to be. So asset management is going to be mostly about water, wastewater, roads, and bridges. And I'm sure that's no real surprise to most of the people in the room. But there is some good news. Municipal capital investment has been picking up since the early 2000s. I think Gary might have talked about that a little bit this morning, or Pat. And that's partly thanks to increased grants from federal and provincial governments, but not just for that reason. So this is kind of an interesting chart. So Walkerton was in 2001, and you can see the increase in municipal investment after 2001 as new regulations were put in place and awareness of the importance of infrastructure began to rise. You can also see the impact of the financial crisis in 2009. Investment went down. And then the impact of the federal and provincial stimulus programs in 2010 and 2011. And since then, municipal infrastructure investment has remained somewhere around $10 billion a year. And that's a mix of building new infrastructure, doing asset management, and maintenance, which is something that tends to get counted as capital quite a bit, but really isn't infrastructure investment. So here are some of the key findings around capital. Municipalities are responsible for a much bigger slice of the infrastructure pie than in the past, and demographic and economic shifts are creating quite significant infrastructure challenges and distributional issues. So those who are absorbing population, it seems like they don't have enough infrastructure, and those losing populations may actually have too much infrastructure. And then many, and perhaps most, municipalities are not keeping up with their asset management needs. So debt, second piece of the fiscal strategy puzzle. Should you or shouldn't you use debt? So this is a hot issue. Some people say it makes sense to use debt because it spreads the cost of infrastructure over its useful life, so it's fair. Those who use the infrastructure are paying for it through debt charges. Another reason that people issue debt is that municipalities have to build infrastructure in advance of growth, and the development charge revenue to pay for that infrastructure doesn't arrive until after the infrastructure is built. So this is a pretty simple equation. People have to be able to flush their toilets when they move into their new house. So the infrastructure has to get built first. Other people say debt has bad effects. So they say it encourages too much capital spending, it shifts costs to future generations, and it crowds out spending on other priorities. And both the pro and the anti-debt camps have some validity. The key thing to realize is that you should not be taking a dogmatic position on debt in isolation from the rest of your fiscal strategy. So how you use debt depends on your capital plan, how you want to use reserves, your policy position on intergenerational equity, and of course your ability to actually issue debt. Not everyone can. So we as a group owe $17.3 billion. So that seems like a lot, and it actually is a lot. But as a comparison, the province of Ontario this year will be issuing $26 billion worth of debt. If you're a growing municipality, you are quite likely to be a debt issuer. 87% of the debt is held by growing municipalities. And here are the top 10, all of whom are either growing or fast growing. The top 4, Toronto, York, Ottawa, and Peel, are kind of in a class by themselves. They account for about 60% of all municipal debt, just on their own. Another thing to notice is that the debt is overwhelmingly held by municipalities that have responsibility for expensive infrastructure, such as water, wastewater, and arterial roads. And again, that's kind of what you would expect. Close to 2/3 of the debt is for water, wastewater, and transportation, so no real surprise there to anyone. Something that did surprise us a little bit, though, is that about 13% of the debt is for social housing. And almost 1 in 5 municipalities have either no debt or very little debt. So very little debt means less than $10 a person. Declining municipalities are the least willing to take on debt, probably because they realize they can't afford the carrying costs. And quite a few, this surprised us, quite a few fast-growing municipalities also tend to avoid debt. And these are lower-tier municipalities that have their expensive infrastructure supplied by their upper-tier municipalities, all of whom do issue debt. So here are the key reasons that municipalities issue debt. There are 4. To finance infrastructure in advance of growth, to finance asset management spending when they have large, old, high-needs infrastructure, when they need expensive infrastructure to comply with regulations, and when they need to match federal or provincial grants. So sometimes when we have to put up our 1/3 share or whatever it happens to be, the cash isn't readily lying around, so debt becomes the default. So now let's turn to reserves, or savings as it's easier to call them. So the quality of your reserve management is a key factor in determining whether you can actually achieve financial sustainability. It's the 3rd leg of the fiscal strategy, along with your long-term capital plan and your debt management plan. So in the world of asset management, the alternative to saving for asset replacement and major life cycle costs is quite stark. If you don't have reserves, you can either issue debt or you can let your infrastructure gradually fall apart. That's about the universe of choice. The average municipality has saved about $1,865 per household, which is actually less than $1,000 a person. So I hope that your own personal savings are in better shape than that. The fast-growing municipalities have saved the most, getting on for 40% more than the average. And this is actually good news because they're taking advantage of their fiscal capacity to save while they can. But something that surprised us as we were looking at the data is that the declining municipalities are actually saving at a rate slightly above the average. So we're still trying to figure that one out, but it does appear that some of them have access to unusual revenue sources, such as local hydro companies that may be helping them build reserves. And here's the top 10 savers. And interestingly, the top 3 savers, York, Toronto, and Peel, are also members of the Club of 4 that issues the most debt. The lone exception is Ottawa, which is in the top 4 for debt, but it drops to 8th in savings. So the fact that a few municipalities are both large debt issuers and high savers suggests that they are probably pursuing relatively sophisticated fiscal strategies. So a crucial question is how much you should be saving. And the answer depends on a few things, such as the timing of investment in your asset management plan. And it also depends on how much you are able and willing to spend directly from your property tax revenue rather than drawing on reserves. And you will need a perspective on how you want to use debt versus reserves. I want to spend a few minutes on intergenerational equity because it's something you should really think about when you're thinking about your overall fiscal strategy. So what are we talking about when we say intergenerational equity? That's a term that tends to get thrown around a little bit these days, and I'm not sure people always know what it means. So good fiscal planning means that generation of people who benefit from something, let's say from an asset, is also the one paying for it. But there's a growing body of literature that says that the children of the baby boomers will be the first generation in a long time to have lower lifetime income than their parents. So what that means is we need to at least think about saving more today to be able to pay for future asset management needs, because the next generation might not be as capable of saving. So this chart tells you a little bit more about that. So this is a long time series, all the way back to 1976, of real income per person for various age groups. And it's showing you annual increases in income after you take out the effect of inflation. So the red line is for the under 25-year-olds, and the green line is for the 25 to 34-year-olds. And you can see that for those people, the young people, their incomes have either been falling in real terms since 1976, or they've stayed the same. On the other hand, look at the other two lines. The light blue line is the 55 to 64-year-old age group. The, I guess you call it a royal blue line, is for 65 and over. So the incomes of the baby boom generation, on the other hand, in contrast to the young people, have been growing quite nicely. So what this chart is telling us is the older generations are much better off than they were 35 years ago, and the younger generations are the same or worse off. And what is the result of that? Well, one result is that family formation is being delayed. This chart shows you fertility rates. So you can see the different ages on the different lines. So in just a decade, which is an incredibly short amount of time for a change in a demographic variable, the fertility rate for women in their 20s has noticeably fallen, and the fertility rate for women in their 30s has risen significantly. So that means, obviously, that women are waiting longer to have children. And there are a number of reasons for that. But one is the difficulty that young people are having in getting established in today's economy. And this, I think, should make all of us think about what we're leaving to the younger generations in terms of overall financial obligations. Not just debt, but also the amount of savings and the condition of the infrastructure that we are leaving them. So here's an example of a practical test that we did about intergenerational equity. So Walkerton happened 15 years ago. People died. So you would think that that would have galvanized investment in water systems, and to some extent it has. However, when you look at the question, I think Pat alluded to this morning, when you look at the question of whether municipalities have achieved full cost recovery for their water and wastewater systems, 70% have not. And I'm sure that more than 3 out of 10 municipalities think they are at full cost recovery, but the facts say otherwise. So this chart shows a strong inclination to pass costs on to future generations. And in effect, many municipalities are shifting the burden of asset management to future generations by keeping tax and rate increases at or below the rate of inflation. So, and I realize there's lots of good political reasons for that, but the effect of it is that we are not paying today for what we are using today. So what does all this mean for sustainability? So I don't have time to take you through all the analysis we've done, so I'm going to tell you a bit of a story for 2 of the groups of municipalities to give you a sense of the financial sustainability challenges that they are facing. And I'm going to start with declining municipalities. So these are municipalities, this is the last time I'll say anything about stats. These are municipalities whose population is falling at a rate more than 1 standard deviation below the average. So fairly noticeably. So many municipalities in Northern Ontario are declining, and they show in blue on this map. Most of Northern Ontario is unorganized territory, so we've just shown that as a simple gray, and you can see lots of blue on this map. But there are also some declining municipalities in Southern Ontario too. They are also shown in blue, and they're mostly in Southwestern Ontario and Eastern Ontario. If any of you are interested, I can tell you later who's who. So this slide shows you the average population of municipalities in each of the growth profiles that we're using: fast growing, growing, stable, and declining. And the message, so the decliners are the little blue bar on the left, and the message is pretty straightforward. Declining municipalities tend to be small, and they frequently have economic challenges. So the average size of a declining municipality is about 4,400 people. So here we are applying the conceptual framework I introduced earlier in the presentation. So this chart, again, graphs fiscal capacity against infrastructure intensity, and you see some green lines. Those green lines are the Ontario averages. And each of the blue dots represents one of the declining municipalities, and there are 98 of them. So 98 of Ontario's 444 municipalities have declining populations. So we can see a few things from this chart that kind of leap off the page. First, almost all of the decliners have below average fiscal capacity. And second, their infrastructure intensity is all over the place, which is to be expected. So, and that's because some of the decliners will have large geographic areas with lots of roads and bridges, and some will not. Some will have conditions that require more complicated water treatment than others, and so on. So almost all of the decliners are in the bottom right quadrant, the unfortunate zone, or they're in the bottom left, where fiscal strategy is critical. Only 4 of the 98 are in the fortunate zone in the top left. So there are some challenges for the decliners. So this is the second piece of the conceptual framework I showed you earlier. So this charts infrastructure intensity against investment needs. And almost 30% of the decliners are in the upper right, and that means they have lots of old infrastructure. And another 30% are in the bottom right, so they also have old infrastructure, but not as much of it. And we estimate that at least 80% of declining municipalities have deteriorating infrastructure. It's probably more, but we're sure it's 80%. Decliners tend to avoid debt like the plague. And you can see all the blue dots along the bottom of this chart, and that means all those municipalities along the bottom, or near the bottom, means they have no debt, or they have almost no debt. But, interestingly, there are a fair number, about 30%, who have found it necessary to take on above average debt levels, so above the Ontario average, because they have more infrastructure than average. So those folks are in the top right quadrant, and they are probably suffering. Many of the slides I've shown you actually have policy implications. I haven't had time to draw them all out, but this is one that does have significant policy implications when you think about financial sustainability for the decliners. So what it shows you is that declining municipalities are much more reliant on grants and subsidies than other municipalities, which reflects their relatively poor fiscal capacity. So grants and subsidies account for about 45% of capital spending for decliners, which is more than twice as much as for other municipalities. So what that says is that to achieve financial sustainability for the decliners, provincial and federal grants are going to be part of the solution. So here's some of the key findings. So municipalities with declining populations are likely to have deteriorating infrastructure. Many of them have no debt, and that's smart, actually, because they know they can't afford the carrying costs, even though they have compelling investment needs. So some municipalities have no choice but just to sit there and wait for the next grant program and otherwise let their infrastructure deteriorate. So now let me turn to the opposite end of the spectrum, the fast-growing municipalities. So the red municipalities on this map are the fast growers, and they're mostly in the 905 belt around Toronto, with a few more in central Ontario and in the Ottawa area. So we're back to our conceptual framework now. This is fiscal capacity against infrastructure intensity, and every blue dot is a fast-growing municipality. There's 37 of them. And you can see almost all of the blue dots have higher than average fiscal capacity, and none are below average. So complete contrast to the declining municipalities. And their above average fiscal capacity gives them the chance to cope with growth and save for the future if they want to do that. And also, their infrastructure looks okay. So here we have infrastructure intensity against investment needs again. And if you look at where the blue dots are along the horizontal axis, you'll see they're to the left of the Ontario average for investment needs. And that means that they have younger than average infrastructure. And that's what you would expect from the fast growers. So everything looks good up to this point for the fast growers. But they are actually not out of the woods financially. They face at least 3 big challenges to their long-term financial sustainability. And here they are. A potential disconnect between actual growth and the provincial growth plan, heavy reliance on development charges to fund infrastructure, and the future cost of asset management for a big asset base. So this chart shows you the domino effect of the provincial growth plan legislation on these municipalities. So the fast growers are busy building infrastructure to support the population targets in the provincial growth plan. And municipalities are required to make sure their population targets in their official plans conform to the provincial growth plan numbers. And so the engineering departments come up with infrastructure master plans that include the infrastructure needed to support that population in the official plan, which conforms with the provincial growth plan. And then municipalities try and budget to implement what is in their master plans for infrastructure. So what happens if the growth contemplated in the growth plan doesn't materialize, or it comes much later than expected? Well, one thing is for sure, good things do not happen. And this is, in fact, what seems to be happening in some municipalities. So this chart compares the provincial growth plan forecast population, which is in blue, over the last 5 years, with StatsCan's estimate of what's actually been happening in green. And you can see a different pattern of growth than what was originally expected. So Toronto, very surprisingly, Toronto and Peel are growing faster than expected, while York, Durham, and Halton are growing more slowly than expected. And it's not just population that's below growth plan targets. The same is true for employment. In fact, even more so for employment. So this slide helps to explain what is going on. The blue line's Toronto. The red line is the 905. For anybody who doesn't know what the 905s are, it's just the municipalities around Toronto. So Halton, Peel, York, and Durham. And they're all fast growers. And what this graph is showing you is the migration of young adults. So 25 to 44-year-olds, and those people are key for economic growth. And what you can see from the chart is that Toronto has gone from a net loss of almost 10,000 of these 25 to 44-year-olds in the early 2000s to a gain of almost 10,000 in recent years. And the 905s have done exactly the opposite. They've gone from a gain of close to 50,000 to a gain of only 20,000, and that is a precipitous decline. So what this is telling us is, it's a comment on the millennials. So much to everyone's surprise, people in the 25 to 44-year-old age group are choosing to buy condos in Toronto and avoid the long commute from the 905 regions. Now, whether that trend will persist or not, when family formation and labor market attachment improve, it remains to be seen. That's one of the things that makes forecasting hard. So does it matter if growth is lower than expected in these fast-growing municipalities? And the answer to that is yes, it does. It matters a lot in terms of financial sustainability. And what it means is that we're likely building too much infrastructure, or we're building it too fast. And to make things worse, if growth is slower than expected, the development charges needed to pay for growth-related infrastructure will also be lower than expected. And that's indeed what is happening, as this chart shows you. The blue bars are the expected development charge collections, and the green bars are the actual. We've vetted this with all the relevant municipalities, so the chart is accurate. And all of the 905 regions are affected, as well as some others. So if development charges are below expectations, that means more debt and more risk. And it could even mean stranded debt or stranded infrastructure, which is debt that cannot be paid as planned or infrastructure that sits unused. So for example, an independent study commissioned by one region, I won't name the region, it wasn't York, showed that they could face, this particular region, one region, could face stranded debt of about $2 billion due to poor non-residential development charge collections. Low development charge collections could also mean that capital spending would need to be cut. But if the regions cut capital spending, they won't have the infrastructure needed to meet the growth plan targets. So it's a catch-22. You might also think that fast-growing municipalities would be investing enough in asset management, so we'd only have to worry about growth infrastructure and not have to worry about asset management. But surprising to us, actually, it turned out that's not the case, and we are currently estimating that about 60% of the growing and fast-growing municipalities are not investing enough in asset management. It's actually probably quite a bit higher than that, but that's a relatively conservative estimate. So ultimately, as other speakers have said, fast-growing municipalities are going to need entirely new revenue sources. The appetite for property tax increases seems to be somewhere in the 2 to 3% range per year, and that is just not going to be enough to cover all of the infrastructure costs that are coming down the pipe, so to speak. So new revenue sources are going to be needed. And they're going to need to cover at least three things. First, rising asset management costs on a large infrastructure base. Second, all the new infrastructure that's being built is going to have operating costs, and those operating costs are going to be big. And third, under current rules, the tax base and the rate base are going to have to absorb the growth-related capital costs that development charges do not cover. And that can amount to 30% or more of total growth-related costs, which can easily amount to hundreds of millions of dollars. So here's some of the key findings for growth-related municipalities. So they have, for fast-growing municipalities, they have financial sustainability challenges, but different ones from other municipalities. And they do face a risk of stranded infrastructure or stranded debt, and they also face looming asset management challenges. And as I said, ultimately, new revenue sources, substantial new revenue sources, are going to be needed. So let me just conclude with a few take-home points. So financial sustainability is about the stewardship of the long term. And the path to financial sustainability is highly dependent on a municipality's rate of growth. And most municipalities, to achieve financial sustainability, are going to need a fiscal strategy that articulates the long-term relationship between the capital plan, reserve management, and debt management. And intergenerational equity is also going to have to be a critical part of real financial sustainability. Fiscal capacity, infrastructure intensity, and investment needs will all have a major impact on how easy or how difficult it is to achieve financial sustainability. And as you think about asset management, it is simultaneously one of the greatest challenges to financial sustainability, and it is also essential to achieve financial sustainability. And the last point I'll make is the time to act is now, while financial sustainability is potentially within reach. And my last comment is that achieving financial sustainability is going to take wisdom, courage, judgment, and maybe a bit of luck. And that concludes my talk. I'll be around this afternoon in case any of you have any questions. Thank you all very much for listening.
Well, thank you, Bill, and for this insightful program. And we certainly want to take this opportunity on behalf of all of our delegates and the AMO board. Thank you for giving up some of your time, and I'm sure busy time, to come and talk to us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Gary.
Well, ladies and